Welcome to this digital press conference hosted by the Cape Independence Advocacy Group. Thank you so much for everybody who's here joining us this morning. The format of this press conference will be as follows. Firstly, Phil Craig will make a statement on behalf of the CIAG and will share the key findings of our recent poll. After that, we'll firstly be taking questions from the press, and after that, questions from the public will be responded to. We just want to ask the press, members of the press, to, if you do want to ask a question in the chat, just please identify yourself by first stating your name and also the publication that you're from. And without any further ado, I'm going to be handing over to my colleague, Phil Craig.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks so much, and thank to everybody else that's joined us this morning. I'm just going to jump straight in and to get on with the polling results. I'm going to read the question using the exact wording which was asked in the poll, and then announce the results to that question. I will then share with you the infographics which we've prepared that relate to that specific result. Once I've shared all of the results, I'll then make a short statement on behalf of the CIAG before taking questions. So starting with the methodology for the poll, Victory Research conducted the poll on behalf of the CIAG. The sample size was 1,080, was fully representative, and comprised only adults residing in the Western Cape over the age of 18. The poll's margin for error is 5%, and polling took place between 24th of July and the 14th of August 2023. And the first question we're going to share with you is about the direction in which South Africa is heading. And the question read, in general, are things in South Africa going in the right direction or in the wrong direction? Right direction, 19.6%, wrong direction, 77%, did not say or undecided, 3.3%. And this sentiment of negativity was shared by all of the three main race groups in the Western Cape. Then the second question we asked related to the Western Cape relative to South Africa and said, well, what about your province? Do you believe your province is better managed or worse than the rest of South Africa? Better, 62.1%, worse, 31.6%, did not say or undecided, 6.3%. And for this question, the majority of coloured and white respondents thought that the Western Cape was better run than the rest of South Africa, and a majority of black respondents did not think that the Western Cape was better run than the rest of South Africa. The third question that we're going to share with you dealt with the question of provincial autonomy, and the question read, next, I'm going to read you some pairs of statements. After I read each pair, please tell me which one is closest to your views, even if neither is exactly right. Provincial governments should be given more power to choose their own policies, or provincial governments should not be given more power to choose their own policies. More power, 76.2%, not more power, 20.8%, did not say or undecided, 3%. And again, this sentiment of more or greater provincial autonomy was shared by the majority of all three race groups. The fourth question that we're going to share asked respondents in the poll to look forward one generation into the future and to imagine what South Africa would look like. The question read, looking into the future, which one of the following comes closest to how you think South Africa will look in 25 years' time? South Africa will have solved most of its problems and life will have significantly improved for most South Africans. Conditions will have remained more or less the same, or South Africa will have become a failed state and living conditions will be worse than they are now. Better, 30%, same, 23.7%, failed state, 39.6%. And for this question, black respondents were relatively optimistic, thinking that conditions would either stay the same or get better, whilst coloured and white respondents were largely pessimistic, thinking that things would probably get worse. And we've got our first infographic now that we can share with you, which shares the graphic of how people think the future of the Western Cape will look. So then moving on to our fifth question, which we're going to share. And this question deals with the referendum on Cape independence. And the question said, do you support or oppose the idea that there should be a referendum in the Western Cape to test whether people in the province would like the Western Cape to become an independent country, separate from the rest of South Africa. Support 68.0%, oppose 20.8%, did not say 1.9%. And we can share now our second graphic, which deals with the level of support for a referendum on Cape independence. Then moving on to the sixth question, which was then, do people support Cape independence? And the question read, now thinking again, do you support or oppose the Western Cape becoming an independent country? Support 58.4%, oppose 30.2%, did not say, undecided 6.7%. And for the first time, the majority of people in the Western Cape, beyond the margin of error for this poll, which is 5%, the majority of people in the Western Cape now support Cape independence. And interesting, also for the first time, support amongst the coloured community is now highest at 78%, and white respondents are now 62%. Support has also increased amongst black respondents to 31%. So we have several infographics that we'd like to share that deal with this question. The first one, our third graphic, deals with the level of support for Cape independence now in the Western Cape, 58%. The second one puts the level of support for Cape independence alongside the level of support for referendum in the same graphic. The third one then charts the growth in support over the 3 years that the CIAG has been polling Cape independence in the Western Cape. The fourth graphic then asks, who is it that's supporting Cape independence? And actually what you'll see from this graphic, which almost exactly represents or reflects our last poll, is that 69% of Cape independence supporters are voting for the DA. And we hope that once and for all, that this will put to bed the notion that support for Cape independence can be measured with who votes for the Cape Independence Party, which is a small party that we can see clearly the vast majority of Cape independence supporters are voting for the DA, and the correct way to establish whether the people of the Western Cape support Cape independence is in a referendum, which is the internationally accepted method. It's a single issue vote, and it does not force people to have to choose between the DA, who they obviously think are a relatively competent government in the Western Cape, and Cape independence. And to emphasize this, our seventh graphic isolates DA voters and to see what they think about Cape independence. Just wait for that to come up now. So we can see that 61% of Cape independence support Cape independence outright, and 79% of DA voters support a referendum on Cape independence. And then our eighth and final graphic on this particular question deals with, well, who are these people? Who is it? So we've dealt with politically who's voting Cape independence. This one dealt with racial groups. And we can see their support for Cape independence amongst all three race groups from Cape independence. But by far, the 2/3 of Cape independence supporters are coloured. So moving on then to our seventh question, which now deals with the consequences of Cape independence. And the question read, regardless of whether or not you support the idea of Cape independence, do you believe that if the Western Cape was an independent country, your quality of life would improve or worsen? Improve 64.4%, worsen 26.6%, did not say, undecided 6.7%. And the overwhelming majority of coloured and white respondents thought that Cape independence would improve their quality of lives, and a slight majority of black respondents thought that it would not. And now we bring up our ninth graphic, which deals with this question of quality of life. And then also our 10th graphic, which kind of gives the logical progression of why people support Cape independence in the first place. And here we can see 77% of voters think that South Africa is going in the wrong direction, 76% want more control of their own policies and destiny, and 64% believe that their quality of life would improve. And with those, in such circumstances, it should be fairly easy to understand why people support Cape independence. Moving then on to the 8th question that we dealt with, we're going to share with you, and that deals with the subject of non-racialism. And I'm going to read the question again. Next, I'm going to read you some pairs of statements. After I read each pair, please tell me which one is closest to your views, even if neither is exactly right. I believe South Africa belongs to everybody who lives here, regardless of their race. Or, I believe South Africa is an African country and other races should behave as guests. Belongs to all, 64.8%. Other races as guests, 32.3%, did not say 2.9%. And here there was quite a stark difference between the races. More than 80% of white and coloured voters felt that South Africa belonged to people of all races. But somewhat alarmingly, 69% of voters in the Western Cape, 69% of black voters in the Western Cape believed that other races should behave as guests. And this was up from 45% in our last poll. And we have a graphic to illustrate this too. And this shows with support for non-racialism in the Western Cape. And then the 9th and final question that we're going to show for you or share with you is why people vote for the party that they vote for. And actually there were 2 questions here that we dealt with, and you'll see they're linked. So the first question read, if provincial elections were taking place today, which party would you vote for? Please excuse me. And then after they answered that, we followed up with, what is the main reason that you would vote for that party? I would vote to support the policies and views of that specific party. I would vote for that party to keep a different party out of government. Or I would vote for that party because it's the best available option, the best of a bad bunch. And 38.9% of voters were voting because they supported policies of party policies of the party they're voting for. 17.2% were voting to keep other parties out of power, and 32.3% were voting for what they believed was the best of a bad bunch. And interestingly here, the political parties which had the most enthusiastic voters were the Freedom Front Plus at 91% and the EFF at 75%, whilst the parties who had the least enthusiastic supporters were the DA at 32% and the ANC at 22%. And our final graphic then deals with, in the context of the Western Cape, why is it people in the Western Cape are voting for the DA? And we can see that 32% are voting because they like their policies, 10% to keep the ANC out, and 42% because they believe the DA is the least worst option. So that concludes the key findings of the poll. And these results are now available on our website, which is www.capeindependence.org. We'd now like to share some thoughts around the implications of the results and to talk about what happens next. It has been clear for some time that there is now very substantial support for Cape independence amongst Western Cape voters, and this poll once again confirms this. 2/3 of Western Cape voters now support a referendum on Cape independence, and a clear majority support Cape independence itself. In a democracy, we simply cannot ignore this. So the question then becomes, what must we do? And at the CIAG, we believe the answer is simple. The established and best international practice is to call a referendum and to allow the people of the Western Cape to irrefutably demonstrate their democratic wishes on Cape independence. Cape independence is not going to go away. Support for it is growing significantly, and we simply have to deal with this question. And I'd like to take a few more moments just to pack this out. A majority of Western Cape voters have supported a referendum on Cape independence since 2021. The constitutions of both South Africa and the Western Cape explicitly empower the Western Cape Premier to call a referendum. The DA has tabled legislation in the National Assembly which seeks to tidy up the enabling legislation which governs how a provincial referendum would be called. And before the 2021 elections, the DA said that whilst they did not support Cape independence, they acknowledged that ultimately it was a decision for the Western Cape people to make for themselves in a referendum. More than that, and out of respect for the DA and its leaders, we've never previously made the details of this public. DA leader John Steenhuisen personally promised myself and the CIAG the DA would fix the referendum legislation and that they would call a referendum which included a question on Cape independence. It's now time for the DA to make good on their 2021 election promises and to call a referendum on Cape independence. We'd like to take this opportunity to remind the DA that the Western Cape government, which they lead, is obliged by the Western Cape Constitution to act in the best interests of the Western Cape people. 68% of Western Cape voters support a referendum on Cape independence. 64% believe Cape independence would improve their quality of lives, and the same number believe that conditions in South Africa are not going to improve. The DA themselves are predicting doomsday after 2024. In such circumstances, how can it possibly be in the best interests of the Western Cape people to deny them a referendum which would allow them to choose their own destiny? The separation of party and state is a fundamental principle of the South African Constitution, and a principle which the DA themselves have fought extremely hard to uphold, where the ANC has clearly abused it. Principles sometimes come at a cost, and with Cape independence, the DA is now on the other end of the stick. We understand that the DA has national political ambitions, and the DA have reminded us at the CIAG regularly that 70% of their voters reside outside of the Western Cape. And to be clear, we support all attempts to unseat the ANC both nationally and in other provinces. But ultimately, that is a decision for the people who live in those provinces and in the rest of South Africa. Premier Alan Winde and the government he leads were elected by the Western Cape people to serve the Western Cape people, and they must now listen to the Western Cape people. The political interests of the DA must not factor in the fundamental question of whether the Western Cape people wish to remain a part of South Africa or whether they wish to break away and form their own independent country. And this brings us back to the question of what must happen next. I can now announce that 6 political parties and organisations have come together to jointly call for a referendum on Cape independence to be held on Election Day 2024. These organisations are the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, Cape Exit NPC, the Freedom Front Plus, the Cape Independence Party, the Cape Youth Front, the Swartland Actiegroep. They will now write to Premier Winde and President Ramaphosa calling for a referendum on Election Day 2024, and we will be inviting members of the public to support this call by also signing the letter. A dedicated website has been set up for this purpose at www.capereferendum.org. We are aware that the referendum bill, which tidies up the regulations around provincial referendums, has not yet been passed by the National Assembly. At this stage, we do not intend to disclose why the DA has taken more than 2 years to table its own referendum legislation, but reserve the right to do so if it becomes necessary. In any case, it is of no real consequence. Our legal team are firmly convinced that Premier Winde can call a referendum, which he is constitutionally empowered to do, using the existing Referendums Act, into which his right to call a referendum can be read in. Regardless of this, even if the Premier genuinely believes he does not have the ability to exercise his unquestionable constitutional right to call a referendum, he can simply ask the President to give effect to his call, since the existing Referendums Act explicitly enables the President to do so. So in closing, we want Premier Alan Winde to call a referendum on Cape independence on Election Day 2024. With doomsday approaching, it is now time to ask the Western Cape people what they want and to allow them to determine their own future. In a democracy, the will of the people must count. Thank you. Back to you, Renee.
Thank you, Phil. I just want to remind you once again that a copy of the polling result, infographics, and also the statement will be available on the CIAG website, and it's linked in the description below that website. Okay, we'll now be taking questions. To members of the press, just a reminder again to please identify yourself with your name and also the publication that you're from before asking your question in the chat. All right, our first question is from Andre Beetge, and the question is, what is the chance of a referendum ballot being in the 2024 national elections in the Western Cape?
Thanks, Andre. And I guess the answer to that is we're about to find out. I prefer to always give people the benefit of the doubt. As I mentioned in the statement, DA leader John Steenhuisen personally promised me and the CIAG, I wasn't the only person in the meeting, a referendum on Cape independence, and publicly alluded to that when they announced their position on a Cape independence referendum before the 2021 elections. We know that for their own political reasons, the DA would prefer not to call a referendum on Cape independence. I think now we've brought that matter to a head. We've said it was promised. You're threatening us or telling us that doomsday is a likely scenario. We've now demonstrated that the majority of people clearly want one. So now there is absolutely no reason whatsoever. And in fact, it would be, in my mind, immoral not to call a referendum on Cape independence. So I think there has to be some chance that a referendum will be called on election day 2024. There's no reason why it can't be. But politicians are politicians, and it remains to be seen whether the DA are going to act in the best interest of the Western Cape people, or they're going to act in what they perceive to be the best interests of the DA. I guess we're going to find out in the next few weeks.
Thanks. Okay, the next question. Do we know if the DA will vote for or against the Western Cape People's Bill? Have they given any reasons?
Well, they've stated that they intend to vote against the Western Cape People's Bill. We don't know whether that'll happen. Actually, as an organisation, we have written to every single member of the Western Cape Parliament and actually reminded them of exactly what we said about in this particular press release, that they have a constitutional obligation to act in the best interest of the Western Cape people, and we've asked every single Western Cape MP, regardless of their party's position, to actually examine their conscience and to actually fulfil their constitution, because each one individually swears an oath to uphold the Western Cape Constitution. And we're asking for MPs to abide by that oath and to pass the Western Cape People's Bill. But at this point in time, we think the DA whip certainly will be asking them to vote against it. In terms of reasons, no, they haven't, is the honest answer. And obviously they have this Western Cape Provincial Powers Bill. Our position is that these two bills should both be passed and would work very, very well together. The DA wants to pass their bill, and they want to vote down the Freedom Front Plus's bill, which we think is very, very foolhardy and certainly not in the best interest of the Western Cape people.
The next question is from Elizabeth. How will Independent Cape work under BRICS?
I presume that, okay, so I'm presuming that's bricks with not mortar and bricks. Look, interesting to see, and I think that's a very, very good question. The world is fundamentally changing. And we're having this global realignment, I think that's going to be one of the questions that the new government of the Independent Cape of Good Hope is going to have to determine where its best interests lie. So difficult for me to say what that is, because I have no authority to speak on behalf of a country that doesn't even yet exist. We are fighting for the Western Cape people to give them their democratic will, and ultimately how we that country, this new country that we're going to create, aligns is going to be a position for the government which the people elect.
Thanks. El Scorpio Perfecto is asking, when will you ask nearby Northern Cape and Eastern Cape communities or adjacent areas if they want to join an independent Cape? Interesting question.
Yeah, also a very good question. So primarily for a number of reasons, but primarily legally and pragmatic reasons. Our initial fight is for the Western Cape, because the Western Cape exists, has a government, it has a border, and the Western Cape has habitually rejected the ANC. The majority of Western Cape voters have never once voted for the ANC, and therefore it's a relatively simple argument to make. But we do know that if we look at voting patterns of South Africa, that those patterns of people who habitually reject the ANC extend beyond the immediate borders of the Western Cape. And I think effectively, once the Western Cape has voted for Cape independence, then the next question will be, and it becomes a reality, then I think that's the time that we would certainly love to see referendums then at municipal level along the border, so that the final border is part of those, because there's going to be negotiations. We have to understand that we're not going to have a referendum on election day, wake up the next day and be a new country. We're going to have a clear expression of the democratic will of the Western Cape people, and that's then going to be a mandate of the Western Cape government to now move forward and to pursue independence for us. And as part of those discussions, I think the border is a critical question, and I'm absolutely certain that at least the southern part of the Northern Cape and the westerlymost part of the Eastern Cape, based on voting patterns, would want to be part of the Cape of Good Hope and not remain in South Africa.
Curtis Fenter is the question that he has is, what about the huge number of Black people moving to the Western Cape? I saw statistics that it will be a majority in 9 years.
Sure. So look, so this is obviously a very sensitive question, and I just want to be careful. So first of all, the movement for Cape independence is inherently non-racial. We're a non-racial organisation, and in the team that govern the CIAG, we have people of all three races. So certainly, it's always difficult in here to understand why people are asking the question. That Black people are not a problem. That they actually are fellow citizens, and the Western Cape has got 3 official languages, and Xhosa is one of them, and there are many people who can trace back their heritage in the Western Cape for many years. This is a fight for the Western Cape people. It's not a fight for white people or for coloured people. It's for all of us. But on the other hand, law and order has broken down in the Western Cape, and if we're then talking about the mass illegal settlement of land in the Western Cape from people who've migrated to it and settled here illegally, and effectively deprived the people who are already here of resources and so on, particularly tax resources, then that's problematic. So our view is, countries thrive on skilled people and people coming in and building their economy, but they have to come legally. They have to come through a normal process. Obviously, at this point in time, there's absolutely no issue with people migrating between provinces. We're all part of South Africa at the moment, and there's free movement of people. But people must come legally. So that for me is the big issue. And what we've seen is in terms of Cape independence, we've seen levels of support increasing amongst all 3 race groups over time. And in fact, the most stable level of support is amongst white voters, and the highest increases in support for Cape independence come from the coloured community and then from Black voters.
Finn has a question. During Brexit in the United Kingdom, the Tories did not support it, even though it was democratically voted for. Do you think the DA can actually make Cape independence work if they get re-elected?
I'm just going to read the question again. Do you really? Yeah, look, so I think, so one of the questions, so if I'm understanding this question right, is in terms of, look, one of the challenges was that you ended up having a Conservative government driving Brexit when its leaders of the Conservative government weren't particularly in favour of Brexit, and the people who drove Brexit would very definitely say that they weren't happy with the way those negotiations were conducted. And I think that's a fair criticism, and it's a danger that we face here, that if we end up with the DA as the Western Cape government leading the negotiations for Cape independence, where would that lead us? And all I can say is, as a movement, we're very aware of that. We absolutely do have plans in place, but it would be premature to talk about that. But it is going to be critical to make sure that any negotiations that form the independent Western Cape are are beneficial on everybody. And to give the DA their credit, and I'm often critical of the DA on some issues, because I think they're worthy of criticism on many of the things they've done around Cape Independence, but they have been, in many on other issues, particularly around provincial autonomy, very, very inclusive, very, very willing to follow this all of society approach, as they call it. As an organisation, we've engaged regularly with them on that basis. So my gut feeling is that they would act in good faith once the decision is made, and I think I would rather have this current DA bunch of leaders than the Tory leaders. So I'm hopeful, but it definitely is a danger. It's an excellent question to ask, and it's something we're very aware of, and we'll have to manage very, very carefully.
Richard Nixon is asking, would Western countries gain any benefits from an independent Cape?
Well, look, I think they would. I think they would, and I think it's a difficult situation, because I think when we start talking about Western, that becomes, particularly in the current world, quite provocative, because Western countries are changing at a sort of rapid rate, and in many ways there's a big difference between what traditionally would have been Western and what's currently Western. But I think, look, a Cape Independence clearly has, would have strategic interest, and I think, we do engage discussions with many international role players, because international support is going to become critical at some point, and without question, the international community is aware of the political benefits of Cape Independence, and therefore people often say nobody's going to support Cape Independence. Well, pretty well of the countries that we've spoken to, and obviously we could never speak to the country itself, that's illegal, they can't interfere in other countries' internal affairs, but you can talk to politicians at parties and so on, we're yet to come across a country that hasn't been enthusiastic about the idea of Cape Independence. It took me as a surprise when I first spoke to the first country. Now when I walk into a room and explain to an international audience about Cape Independence, I expect that they're going to be overwhelmingly in support, and I'm very rarely disappointed.
Lisa Fillion is asking, in which part of the poll are Indian and other races grouped?
So there is a section in the poll of Indian and other, but obviously there's a very, very small Indian population in the Western Cape. In previous years, it's actually shown up. So you have this poll. For example, the margin for error of this poll is 5%. The Indian population is way below 5%, and therefore they may or may not appear in the poll. Now, as it happens, in the first two polls, we had quite a few Indian respondents. In this particular poll, there were no Indian respondents, and therefore they don't appear in the poll because we didn't get any polling information. But in all honesty, the sample size often for really small population groups is almost irrelevant, because the margin of error is then so large that effectively it sort of becomes slightly random. But yeah, there is a section of Indian and other, or Indian Asian, I think it is, and other, but there were no respondents in this poll that came from that population group.
Jay is asking, do you have any existing indication of which countries would recognize
I'm not sure
an independent Western Cape if a referendum result is in favour of independence?
So yeah, interesting one. Yes, we do, but unfortunately, I don't feel at liberty to say. But I mean, I think if you were to guess, you wouldn't be far wrong. I mean, I think it's the Western Cape and South Africa have taken fundamentally, interestingly enough, they're taking fundamentally different positions in global politics, and that automatically is going to mean, regardless of whatever we do in the independence movement, that there are going to be allies and opponents that are decided above our pay grade, but I think if you guess, you won't be far wrong.
All right, our next question is from Royal Bank 556. How would the rest of South Africa, such as Gauteng, be affected by Cape Independence, and will immigration be allowed?
Well, let's take the second half of the second question. Immigration would be encouraged, but because all economies benefit from immigration. It's uncontrolled immigration that's always the problem. Because what tends to happen in uncontrolled immigration is you end up with people who have effectively often become dependent on the state and are there fleeing from other problems, often which are economic, and sometimes problems that they voted for themselves, not always the case. So you have to sort of be able to control immigration, but good immigrants, quality immigrants, people who can grow your economy either through bringing skills or at times bringing labor, are beneficial to the system. And so yes, it would be encouraged, but there would be a fair system that made sure that your people applied, they got in, and it should work very, very simply. As to the rest of South Africa, I think the rest of South Africa has a lot to gain from Cape Independence. Interestingly enough, it's so first of all, South Africa is no longer functional as a state. We've seen that. It's not only are the institutions breaking down, but we're also going into this coalition politics, and I think, quite frankly, the main political parties are trying to put lipstick on a pig. We've got this scenario where we can't form a government because we just fundamentally don't want the same thing, and we're going to end up this totally ridiculous government, which is people with really vastly opposing, who's desperately trying to find some kind of workable compromise, and we've just seen how difficult that is. And we can see in this next election in 2024, you may well see GP, Gauteng and KZN fall under coalition control, but the governments are going to be different as chalk and cheese. So I think, first of all, Cape Independence is actually going to sort of start to cause South Africa to break up, or to certainly become more provincial in the way that it works. And I think that will be really beneficial to people in provinces, where they can start to take more control of their destiny. And then I really hope that beyond that, then obviously, as imagine the plight of Zimbabweans if South Africa hadn't been next door to sort of to become a crutch. And I think the Western Cape has a developmental role in the rest of South Africa. I think South Africa is just going to continue on going down its path. I think parts of it are going to be able to save themselves, part aren't, and then when actually it hits rock bottom, is going to be needing help. And actually the Western Cape is going to always be a friend and an ally to South Africa. They're going to be our neighbours. We're all going to have people on both sides of the border, and actually a really high functioning, prosperous Western Cape is going to be very, very beneficial indeed and actually we can see that, if we just imagine the relationship of South Africa when Zimbabwe went under, and just imagine that playing itself back out, hopefully without all of the people, as coming back to the original question of people coming across the border en masse, in an uncontrolled manner, but actually obviously in a controlled manner. That's a different kettle of fish.
Yeah. Again, a question from Jay. For us regular folk, how can we help to pressure the DA into keeping their promise of including a question about Cape Independence in a referendum?
Well, I think this is going to go in steps, and we're all very conscious. So I have to. Traditionally, I was a DA voter, so I still have a lot of affinity for the DA and its leaders. So by no means am I anti-DA, but at the same time, the bottom line is, if you vote for an ANC government at this point in time, you're going to get a failed state, and if you vote for a DA government, you're going to get a failed state, but it's going to happen a little bit further down the line. Because if we can't control economic policy and we can't control the main levers of our country, then we're just sort of fighting back a tide. So I think let's just take this in steps. The first step is we put up this website, www.capereferendum.org, and I really hope that we can get vast numbers of people behind that, and that will be the easiest and the first point to say to the DA, look, the polling says we want it here. Let's get all of us, our friends, it doesn't matter what we've done up till now, sign that document. Let's get behind this, and let's put some real pressure on the DA to ask them to call this referendum. If they don't, then we're going to have to vote against them in 2024, and that is the reality. There is no way of escaping that, and actually we already have contingency plans in place for that. So if the DA don't support this call for a referendum, then we will oppose them in 2024, and we won't oppose them to try and remove them from government. We recognise that the DA have done a relatively good job of running the Western Cape. People like on balance the DA, and they desperately want to keep the ANC out of power. So under no terms are we going to try and remove them from government, but we are going to do everything humanly possible to force the DA to listen to its own voters. Because I mean, to have a situation where 79% of DA voters in the Western Cape want a referendum on Cape independence, and then find that the DA say, well, we're just going to ignore them and do what we want anyway, is untenable. And actually, it's insulting, and it's putting the interests of the DA and voters in the rest of the country over and above the Western Cape, which is where we elected them. And one of the things that I like John Steenhuisen, but one of the things that John often says is the only reason people want Cape independence is because how well we run the Western Cape. And I often remind him, well, the only reason you run the Western Cape is because the voters in the Western Cape are fundamentally different from the voters of the rest of South Africa, and they've given you the chance to run it. So you have done a good job largely, but you've done a good job because we elected you. And at some point in time, they have to listen to us.
El Scorpio Perfecto again is asking a question. When is the next Freedom March for Cape Independence and for pro-KZN independence organizations to start working closely? I recall there was something in Twitter that happened.
Okay, good question. So look, I have to say, first of all, marches are really hard work to pull off. So people often say, look, and look, I'll be singing to the choir here or preaching to the choir. So I apologise. The people that are here listening to this press statement are almost certainly the people who really put themselves out. But in general, South Africans are a lazy, apathetic bunch when it comes to politics. And to get people out to actually turn up and march is absolutely. It's a huge undertaking, and actually we've done it twice. We've done it successfully. We'd love to do it more often. We'd have a march every week if actually South Africa were marchers, but we see with all political parties, it's not an easy thing to do, and actually do it badly is worse than not doing it at all. So there probably will be another march. In fact, there almost certainly will be another march. But actually, then we've all got to work together to put people onto the streets and make those marches as successful as the last two marches have been. When it comes to KZN, yes, we do from time to time talk to the KZN movement. Yes, there are stirrings in KZN, and in many ways they look to us for inspiration and talk to us because obviously we're a bit further down the line, and we've been quite effective in our purposes. But we can't do KZN independence for them any more than they can do Cape independence for us. Yeah, we've got to do us, and they've got to do them.
All right, Joe Emilio is asking, there are fears of the ANC resorting to violence over Cape independence. How would you prevent any violent techniques from ANC that could derail the movement or success of it?
Yeah, look, a difficult one. I'm an optimist by heart, and my gut feeling. Certainly, we haven't had any. We haven't had any problems at all so far from the ANC in terms of democracy. So I rarely give the ANC a compliment. Yeah, but as I sit here and I've been extremely vocal. Both we have as an organisation and I have personally, and never been threatened, never had any problems. Actually, we've engaged with the ANC. They've always done so politely, even though they obviously hate the idea. So at this point in time, now I accept that maybe they think, well, okay, at this point in time everything's under control. But I've always said, and it's this sort of the same situation, that it really would be politically, it would be an absolute own goal for the ANC to use military force to force a section of the South African population against its democratic will. To follow. They would just have become the colonial power, and for all their faults, I just don't think the ANC are that stupid. Perhaps they may be, and will we have to do something about it? Yes. Are there contingency plans? I can't say they're in place, but I mean, certainly we've thought through all of the scenarios, and we would hope not to be caught unawares. But ultimately, if the ANC wants to suppress Cape independence military with its armed forces, it can. At this point in time, it can, and that would simply delay Cape independence for a year or two. Nothing would galvanise support for Cape independence better than the ANC trying to prevent it at the bullet of the gun rather than at the ballot box.
Andre Bietre is asking, if Steenhuisen breaks his promise to you and we just get ignored like in the last 2 years, what are our options?
There will be political options on the ballot box in 2024, that I can promise you. So there will, so I don't want to say what they are at this point in time, but there are no circumstances where you will be powerless going into 2024. You will be able to vote Cape Independence in 2024 in a number of different parties, and then it'll come down to voters. At the end of the day, we can only do so far as an organisation like the CIAG. We can kick open the door, we can do the polling, we can do the marches, we can do but ultimately, if people aren't going to fight for Cape Independence, they aren't going to get Cape Independence. And we're just a handful of people. At the end of the day, there's 7 million people in the Western Cape. There's 3.1 million voters. Ultimately, if they want it, they'll get it, and if they don't want it, or they don't try hard enough, they won't get it. But there will absolutely be options, and we certainly won't be found wanting on our side.
All right, Go South Online. Why no Cape Coloured Congress?
Well, look, I guess that's a question for the Cape Coloured. That's a question for the Cape Coloured Congress. They were invited.
Well, I'm not sure if there are any more questions. I think we've probably answered or covered most of the burning questions, unless there's maybe somebody who has a last question to ask. It doesn't seem like there are.
Perfect.
All right. Well, we've almost come to the end of our press conference. Just before we end, hang on. Just before we go, we just want to ask everybody who do support Cape Independence to please register your support for this letter, which will be sent to Premier Wendy and President Ramaphosa. So please navigate to Cape Referendum website, which is also in the description below, and go register your support. This then brings us to the end of this press conference. Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you so much for everybody who joined us here this morning. We do appreciate it.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks everybody for joining us.